Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Atlas Network's Europe Liberty Forum 2021, and particularly this panel on pandemic populism. I am honored to chair this session, but luckily Jack Shannon from Atlas Network is here as well, and I am certain that he will be able to correct any mistakes I might make, so thank you, Jack, and everyone at Atlas. Assessing the risks and dangers posed by populism is more important than it had been over the past decades. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly provided a large Overton window for the enemies of freedom across the whole political spectrum, and especially in the poles of the traditional left-right ideological divide. We have seen parliaments closing or drastically diminishing their control over the executive branch of government. We have seen extraordinary measures becoming ordinary and the abnormal becoming the new normal, while citizens were deprived of their basic civil liberties. The radical left and radical right have both attempted to profit from this horrific health crisis in order to accelerate their agendas. In some cases, they have attempted to even nationalize private healthcare or other industries. In other cases, they have managed to push all types of illiberal decisions through the lawmaking process while society was not watching. But of course, populism was already a big problem in our continent much before COVID-19. It has been growing for decades, but especially after the Great Recession. Mainstream parties working within the frame of liberal democracy have failed to seduce an increasing part of the society, which has resorted not to alternatives working for less state and more free market and society, but to the opposite. And such options are even in office in a few countries, while they keep growing across the continent. The ghost of what Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has defined as an illiberal democracy has been unleashed in Europe. And many people have traced parallels with what happened a century ago, when the perfect storm of totalitarianism was still in the making. While that parallel may still be rather far-fetched, there are certainly reasons for concern. We classical liberals and libertarians know that liberty is indivisible. We cherish all of our freedoms all of the time. And today we shall discuss the dangers of populism in Europe from the perspective of both economic freedom and civil liberties. Joining me in the panel are Petar Ganev, Marek Tatawa, and Borja Breña, our panelists for this session. Petar Ganev is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Market Economics in Bulgaria. Thank you very much, Petar, for joining us from the host country of Europe Liberty Forum 2021. Joining us from Warsaw, I believe, is Marek Tatawa. Marek is Vice President of the Civil Development Forum in Poland. So hello, Marek, and thank you for taking part. Hello. And finally, joining us from Madrid, Spain, Borja Breña is a board member of my home organization, the Foundation for the Advancement of Liberty. Thank you, Borja, for being here with us. I will start by making one or two specific questions to each of our speakers. Then we shall engage in conversation, and we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. So I would like to start the conversation with Petar Ganev in Bulgaria. Is economic populism always related to bigger government and higher government spending? Is this crisis worse than the Great Recession and the debt crisis that followed? Can we go back to normal in fiscal terms? And what do you think will be the long-term effect of the pandemic on the role of government?
Thank you, and thank you for having me at this panel. I think our group will be able to cover different issues that are important. It's true that the populism in general is really hard to be defined, especially in the way that we kind of understand it. And this is also the case for economic populism. But if we look at the economic history, it's clear that by economic populism, it's usually related to either regulations that take out freedom and usually don't achieve the stated policy goals and have unintended consequences, but also to more government spending. Of course, during the pandemic, with all the extraordinary powers and all the regulations on social life, We can talk a lot about regulation, and I think that some of these will be covered in our panel. Just recently was published the non-state index that also covers, says the interesting story of the paternalistic policies that we saw increase during the pandemic. But I want to focus more on the more economic and fiscal and monetary side of the issue, and focus in the beginning on government spending side. And government spending during it was always an issue, of course, but during the pandemic, it's something that posed a big challenge to classical liberals and to citizens, basically, because it was kind of accepted by a broader public, and the debate changed. It's usually a complex debate between increasing government spending and the taxpayers and trying to control government. But when it comes to the pandemic, it kind of the situation changed, in the broader consensus, even outside of the liberal movement, was that the government should step in and spend more. And this is why we saw such huge fiscal deficits. So we're basically, we'll get to that, but we lose some of the ground that I think we conquered in the last years. And when you talk about government spending, I always think of it as the term fiscal illusion, something that Krasen Stanchev is usually using, our chair, but also it's a term that go back 120 years ago, even before the Spanish flu. It was in 1903 when Puviani actually wrote about the fiscal illusion. And by fiscal illusion, I basically understand it as that the cost of government is seen to be less than it actually is. So there is free stuff, basically deficit, and all kinds of policies that are financed by deficit. But it's actually a cost that's hidden, and the citizens don't understand that they that it's actually on their shoulders. So I think we lived in a kind of fiscal illusions in 2020, and now, of course, we continue. But definitely, it's not the same crisis. The Great Recession was more of a traditional crisis with the financial sector, the too big to fail story, with all the mistakes being made and the wrong policies before the crisis, monetary, fiscal, and all. But this crisis is it's different. It's not a too big to fail story. Maybe if we use the same slang, it will be something like too unfair to fail for the small business. And we saw that in the first panel. When we talk about businesses being closed with the government decree, just because they need to follow the restrictions, it's really hard to have the classical debate: should the government step in, or should we leave all to the market forces? The debate that we have, even the funny video Hayek versus Keynes more than 10 years ago. Now the debate was kind of different, and the broader consensus was, okay, there should be some compensation for those businesses that are entirely closed by a decree. Just because their property right, as it was mentioned, to generate profit is taken away. But then comes the big question, not only how the government steps in, because there is huge difference between compensation and having basically industrial policy. And we see with the policy in Europe that it's shifting basically more towards industrial policy, especially with the recovery and resilience plan, and not so much now on compensation of closed businesses. Actually, all businesses in Bulgaria are now open, and in many countries, the big chunk of the economy is open. But now the politicians are playing the usual game, which is creating industrial policy and maybe playing with the fiscal illusion. So the big question here is what we're going to do with the debt and the deficit that we see in Europe. And if you look at the data, just before the previous crisis, all the policies were basically wrong. I mean, we were in the good years, and even though we were in the good years, all the countries in Europe were making deficit. It was the case in Germany, obviously the case in Greece. They had actually deficit for 30 years and more. So even in the good years, they were doing deficit, and then the bad years come and there was no backstop. And with the debt crisis in Europe, that actually changed. And if you look at the data prior to the pandemic, most of Europe cleared away from the deficit. For the entire EU, the general government balance was close to balanced for 3 years in a row, less than 1% deficit. Germany was steadily on a surplus, which was not the case 10 or 20 years ago. Greece actually for the first time had a primary surplus and then actually a real surplus, which I think never, for 3 consecutive years, which never happened going back to the 70s or something. So something changed in Europe prior to the pandemic, and it was in a positive way. I mean, I think that we kind of win the battle on the general macro fiscal illusion and the need for fiscal deficit in the good years. But now the pandemic changed that entirely. And this one-time shock, which led to deficit 10% in 1 year, government debt went from in the EU area from 85% to 100% in 1 year. So the big question is how we go back from that, and is it possible to go back to normal times quickly? And by normal times or the usual times, I mean 2017, 18, 19, when we kind of got the deficit under control, and Europe was trying to heal from the government debt. And this dynamic actually changed, and that's the challenge to all of us, that we need to fight back and find the solutions to move back the government from our feet, which was really hard to do in 2020, but now it's the big task in front of us. And then we can talk later on how this poses a challenge on monetary policy and potentially monetary populism. But I think that we can go back to that question on the second part.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Peter. I now turn to Marek Tatawa in Poland. Marek, how are pandemic and government responses to temporary health emergency being used by many politicians to justify economic populism and the so-called new normal with permanently big government? How should classical liberals and libertarians respond to these tendencies?
Thank you, Juan, and thank you for invitation for the Europe Liberty Forum. We are celebrating important day today in Poland because we have Tax Freedom Day. It's 12 days later than last year. So fortunately, since today, we are starting to work ourselves after working 175 days for the government and for taxation. Of course, the fact that this day is much later this year is due to high expenditures during the COVID-19 related crisis and lower tax revenues related to lockdowns. I would like to start with defining 4 dimensions in which I think pandemics is connected with populism. We often were discussing economic populism in terms of fiscal populism, and Peter told us a bit about this fiscal aspect of populism. And I think in Europe, a lot of parties, including mainstream parties that accept liberal democracy and the rules of the game and the rule of law, are also to some extent populist in terms of fiscal policy and fiscal responses to the crisis. Unfortunately, in Poland, this fiscal populism is also related to kind of authoritarian populism with violations of the rule of law, with capture of various independent institutions. And I think this is a very dangerous mix because many things that are harmful for day-to-day life, for operations of businesses, including regulations, violations of the rule of law, can be hidden behind the expansionary fiscal policy. And many people see more money in their wallets because of some social expenditures and social policy programs, and they don't care so much about other aspects of civil liberties and the rule of law. The third dimension of populism during the pandemic that I think appeared in many countries was kind of anti-science populism, like people claiming that there is no pandemic at all, or that there is some kind of global conspiracy connected to big pharmaceutical companies and so on. And I think in Poland, but also in other countries, we noticed some political movements that were using pandemic to build their popularity on some kind of anti-science or just fight with all types of lockdowns or all types of anti-pandemic policies. And finally, the fourth dimension that is also visible in Poland, and I'm sure in other countries in other regions, is economic nationalism. So during the pandemic, or pandemic gave justification to show that we should create or invest in state-owned companies, for example, in pharmaceuticals. We should keep renationalizing the banking sector. We should somehow give privileges to local products in our shops. And for all these things, pandemic is used as justification. And I think what is the most dangerous is connection of these different dimensions of populism. As I said, in Poland, we have government that is using a lot of fiscal populism nowadays to spend a lot after the pandemic. And this is also related to electoral calendar. We have elections in Poland in 2023, in Hungary in 2022. So I think we will see a lot of new social expenditures coming, and the pandemic will be excuse to do this. But when it is connected with authoritarian populism, with this type of violations of the rule of law, of independence of judiciary, of capture of various institutions, then fiscal expansion is used to hide some other things that I think are much more dangerous in the long term, because they may help the ruling parties in Central and Eastern Europe to stay in power for much longer, to stay in power in a way that is not based on democracy or liberal democracy, but is based on political capture of various institutions. And I think it is why we should fight with this type of mixture of various types of populism. And speaking about the responses, I think during the pandemic, we heard a lot of stories about how important government is for our survival, for our security. And we also had many success stories of private sector, many success stories of individuals that were helping other people, many success stories of related to free trade. And I think as classical liberals, libertarians, we should definitely now work on reports, movies, and other products that will make these success stories of private market and individual liberty during the pandemic more visible, to somehow fight with this government propaganda. In Polish public media, you hear almost every day how successful government is in fighting the pandemics, and the successes of private sector are not visible. And I think this is our role to make this private sector successes much more visible. And one last thing is about economic nationalism that is also now stronger after pandemic because of very short time of shortages or problems with some kind of supplies. And in Poland, for example, the government immediately decided to create some kind of state-owned companies that will produce face masks because of the pandemic. And after a few weeks, many private companies were providing face masks, and they are very successful in providing these face masks. So after a year since the government decision to produce masks by state-owned company, these masks are still not produced because it is how long it takes in the government to do things. And I think we should also reveal this type of government failures. And there are many of government failures during the pandemic that were not visible. And this is also our role as free marketers and liberals to do this in the upcoming weeks and months.
Well, thank you very much, Marek. We now have Borja Breña in Spain. Borja, we have heard two powerful positions on the economic side of general populism and pandemic populism, but perhaps you may provide a freedom movement perspective on the non-economic threat. What happened during the pandemic with populist messaging, and what should we expect in the near future?
Hi, yes. So I agree very much with my colleagues in the panel, Peter and Marek, and specifically I'm going to go deeper in what Marek was suggesting. It's just basically all the impact that the populism and the pandemic has had on the freedoms, individual and civil liberties, not just the economic part. We need to remember a few things. Number one, populism is a strategy to win or at least influence power. Okay, it's been tried and tested in the past. Before pandemic, before even democracy. But the funny thing is that it works very well. It's actually very effective with democracy, just because people just can be influenced to vote a certain way. General population might not be thinking deeply about the results of a specific policy. They have probably not read Henry Hazlitt's economics in one lesson. You need to think about the effects of a policy in the long term, not just in the short term, and across the whole spectrum of the population, and not just in a specific group. The general population doesn't do that. They don't have the time to do that. They're busy working. They're busy, looking after their families and having some free time. So that allows basically in democracies populism to grow, and those advocates of populism to, if not win power, at least influence. Okay, and this is from both sides, both the national populism, which is more like the right wing, and the social populism, which is more, if you will, the left wing populism. At the end of the day, populism is Manichaean. It's basically a me versus them. Is we are the people and we represent the people. That's what the politicians or populists say and claim. And the other ones are, the problem and the reasons why we are suffering, why the people are suffering. Could be social populism that blames the rich, the business people, the establishment. Is always against the elite. The national populism, they usually blame the other, which could be an immigrant, could be other states. At the end of the day, it's the same thing. And the problem with democracy is that without checks and balances, without rule of law being defended and protected day after day, without separation of power, not just the populists can actually take power, that maybe has happened in Hungary with Viktor Orban, but also can influence power. Okay, so in Spain we have left-wing social populist political party in government with the Labour Party. In other countries, like in the UK, the main Conservative Party has been trying to bring back the voters that were voting the UKIP, the populist right wing. The same with Labour. The previous UK Labour candidate was basically almost a populist. So the thing is, and this is the second thing that I wanted to say, that the elite, which usually is the one the populists are writing against, are now using the pandemic and the global crisis, coming from the 2007-8 economic crisis. Now they have an angle which is not just money, it's also the health, to exert and execute populist policies. So the elite now, the governments that are not theoretically populist, the ones that are more mainstream, the ones that they call themselves just Labour or Conservative, or even central liberals, just, in general, all of them defend social democracy, are now using pandemic, the health crisis, to advocate and put together, put forward policies that were basically only advocated by the populists 20, 30 years ago. Okay, so, and this is not just in democracies, it's everywhere. You see China and Venezuela and many other countries that were already not democracies using pandemic to control even more the liberties of the people, but also in countries such as Taiwan. Now you go anywhere in Taiwan and you're controlled. You're basically, your mobile phone is knows where you are, and the government controls exactly where you are. Singapore, everywhere you go into a shop, you need to check who you are. So the governments are using the health crisis to track every individual movement and with the excuse that they need to protect us, they actually are checking exactly what we do, and they eventually will not stop doing it after this pandemic. And here in Europe, we have issues like, in Spain, for example, we have a state of alarm for more than 6 months. So the government could do, many executive decisions without going through the legislative. So the same across Europe, we've already heard about Poland or Bulgaria. In France, this is happening in Germany, curtailing immigration. So just you blame the other people. You don't allow people to move freely, not even move goods freely. There's so many forms to be filled in. Basically, the government wants to control everything, every move, and probably this is not going to go back. It's very hard for liberties that are stolen by the government, whether populist or just social democrats, to be actually recovered by the individual and the people. And we are seeing now that the populist or even non-populist, non-mainstream governments are moving forwards and curtailing freedoms such as for the LGBT community, pushing forwards policies to increase the births and giving money to mothers who want to have more children, just rather than, any woman or any person, in the region or the country. So they're already pushing forwards with lots of policies that are either cutting our liberties as individuals or pushing their own ideology. And this is not just for the populist governments, could maybe happen in Poland, but in normal, as you could call it, just German or even Sweden, or Spain, Italy. So lots of countries are now using populist measures by the elite and not just the outsiders, and mainly to shore up their popular support. Basically, because they promise so much to the people, with the state of welfare and the social democracy has promised so much, and they have not been able to deliver. They haven't delivered economically, and that was shown, in the last crisis. But they have not even been able to deliver in the health, which is the most important thing. They were not ready. They didn't know about this virus. They didn't know how to prepare. As Mark was saying, the state said, no, we are going to be the ones solving the issues. Give me all the power, I'll help you. They couldn't even provide masks. They couldn't provide equipment. They have only been using the same policies that the governments in the Middle Ages were using, which is basically nobody moves, that the governments were using 100 years ago with the 1918 flu. Basically, nobody moves, and just anybody who's ill, just put it aside. Like if, they literally have used no technological advance, which the private sector could have done. And if the government has used any technological advance, it has been always in their favor to basically curtail more individual freedoms, such as happened in Taiwan, Singapore, and China, and many other countries. So I'm worried about the next few years, but to be honest, this is a good thing that makes us remember that we need to fight for liberties every single day, every single year. We cannot just sit back thinking that the populists are out of the government, that the communists or the fascists are already dead. They're not. And even if they're not dead, they're influencing the social democrats, which is basically 80% of mainstream political parties in Europe.
Thank you very much, Borja. And now going back to Petar, we have discussed economics in general, but how does this whole situation correlate to monetary policies? Is there a threat of monetary populism as an answer to high budget deficits and public debt? And do you think that central bank digital currency will play a major role in the future?
Yeah, before going to that, I just want to add something which is related to that we have a global challenge. It was always probably a global challenge, but now more than ever. And we saw that in Bulgaria because at one point of the pandemic in 2020, the entire country was open. There were almost no restrictions, but the entire world was closed. So if everybody is closed and you are open, you are basically closed too. I mean, you have nowhere to go because all the borders are closed. So this kind of gives the example that even if you have a good overall framework in your own country, if something happens on a global level and in your neighbors and in your region, then it basically will hurt you again. And then, so that's why I'm telling that we are facing global challenge, and one such challenge, for instance, will be the potential global corporate tax. So again, the pandemic basically shaken the economic debate and opened for all kinds of ideas, which were probably always there, but they couldn't move forward. And the global corporate tax, which will hurt countries like Bulgaria or Lithuania, especially in Central Eastern Europe, it's such an idea which follows on the potentially on the government spending, fiscal illusions, and so on. But again, when we have such huge debt and countries with high deficit, and we see the projections that the deficit will be there in 2021, 2022, potentially it will be cleared even if they follow their own predictions for 3 or 4 more years, then we have the risk of this this situation going to the monetary policy, and we see all kinds of populistic ideas there. Of course, even now, monetary policy is different than what should be and what we think it's right. But again, there are ideas that go beyond the boundaries that we know. Such an idea will be the modern monetary theory, which basically says that you don't need to have revenues to pay for the spending. You can just print the money. The government can print money. So the fiscal policy and the monetary policy kind of go together. So such ideas, which are, I think, impossible to, they go directly go into question the independence of the central banks, which may be something that we can frame as monetary populism, to openly and directly, academically even, go into question the independence of the central bank. But this is something that it's not a debate that we can have a few years ago, even in the first grade or second grade in university. It's not that there are certain ways that the monetary policy is financing government deficit, obviously in Europe, but not only. But again, it's not so obvious, it's not so direct. And now we see proposals that basically they want to abolish all of check and balances in the monetary policy in order to finance the huge debt in the wealthy world. And now talking about the central bank digital currency, which was influenced probably both by the race of all digital currency, Bitcoin and so on, and their success and the volatility and everything, but also probably by the pandemic. And there are 2 things that it should be mentioned about the central bank digital currency. The first one is that if we have such a currency, then the policy of negative interest rates can go also basically to the cash. I mean, now, even if the bank is having a negative interest rates, at least the cash that you own and could take out of the system is basically the same. But if it's digital and monopolized digital cash, let's say, then you can apply a negative interest rates. And this means that you can manipulate the money supply and the behavior of savers and of people by a new means, something that is not heard of until now. So this is one risk, and the other one is the idea, which is usually connected to the central bank digital currency, which basically states that the citizens will have their own accounts in the central bank. So now the ordinary citizen does not have access to the central bank balance sheet. Basically, it goes to banks, and they have the reserves and everything. So the distribution of money is given to banks, to the private sector, and just the issue of the money is basically regulated by the central bank, the overall framework. But if you have your own account, in the central bank, even a digital account, this changes everything. Then you basically the ordinary citizen will have direct access to the balance sheet of the central bank. This may kill, especially in the time of crisis, the private banking. Obviously, when there is some volatility on the market, all the people will move away from the private banks and open their digital accounts in the central bank because it's more secure, or at least it seems so. So it basically will change the entire monetary theory as we know it if we go into the direction of first having a monopolized central bank digital currency, and second, open it for the citizen to have their own accounts and their access basically to the balance sheet of the central bank. So these ideas, which both either the modern monetary theory, which will collide the fiscal policy and the monetary policy and remove all restrictions for government, or the central bank digital currency, both ideas are extremely strange, and they're not something that was possible to be seriously debated a few years ago. But now, after the pandemic, in the post-pandemic world, with all the urge for global solutions and indebtedness of the wealthy countries and high budget deficit, is something that is at least kind of debated. So again, this is something that we need to look seriously and to try to pull back to sanity, not to the balance of ideas, not to move to populism, but to go back to sanity. And I think that if we look at history, when we talk about growing populism and stuff like that, it always sounds a little bit pessimistic, like we are always losing piece by piece. But it's not necessarily so. I think that populism can hurt all of us, but there are periods in history when it's the other way around, when the policy is going back to normal and closer to the usual market forces. So I just think that we need to keep fighting in this challenging time, in the terms that the debate is new and it's open for everything, and we need to win again the battle of ideas. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. Marek, you spoke before about this threat of a permanent Big Brother government. The pandemic has been used as a justification to remove rules that constrain politicians, or even to break some constitutional rules. Why should we defend constraints on political power, like fiscal rules, fiscal limits in the constitutions, and the rule of law in general? And will this be enough to deter populist politicians?
Before I answer your question, I would like to make a comment on what Borja said about examples from Spain. And when I hear some examples from Spain where in the government you have populist left-wing parties, I can imagine that populist right-wing parties in Poland and Hungary can implement very similar policies. And I think the pandemic showed once again that there are many similarities between illiberal left and illiberal right. At the moment in Poland, the current government wants us taxpayers to pay for some of the programs. And we were warning during the pandemic in Civil Development Forum that people should not demand so much government support, because one day they will have to repay it, and these higher taxes are coming. And who is supporting these higher taxes? Of course, the radical left parties. So there might be some strange coalition in the parliament of right-wing populists and left-wing populists to increase the size of the government. And to limit this type of increases, we need certain type of rules. And during the pandemic, it was a perfect type for enemies of these rules. In Poland, we have the constitutional limit for public debt of 60% of GDP. And I think this is a very important part of our constitution, and defends Poland against some kind of excessive economic populism. Unfortunately, government and also some economists were claiming that because of emergency, maybe we should abandon this limit or change the limit or increase this value. Fortunately, we manage at the moment to defend this limit, and I hope it will stay with us for longer. But there are attempts to remove or destroy this type of rules. Unfortunately, what was happening in Poland is breaking the constitutional limit by various fiscal tricks. So the government was using special government funds to claim that this is not public debt, this is some other type of expenditure. And so we now have a lot of money out of official fiscal public budget. And this is also very bad for transparency of fiscal policy, because it also gives opportunity to future governments to use this type of loopholes and to increase this fiscal creativity in terms of government sector. What I'm also worried about are other rules, for example, the rule of law. And of course, Poland is one of the countries where this crisis of rule of law is very visible. We had a lot of examples of violation of independence of the justice system. And also during the pandemic, this area was kind of forgotten, like many people were busy with day-to-day survival of their businesses, of finding or making sure they have money for day-to-day life. And I think to some extent parts of the population forgot about this rule of law crisis. So now we have to rebuild this support for the rule of law and show why these rules are important for our day-to-day life, for businesses, and for also the survival of the European Union. And I am happy that at the EU level, the topic of the rule of law is discussed, but I think the EU should do much more regarding countries that violate the rule of law, the standards of the European Union, and at the same time are financed by a lot of EU funds. And speaking about this finance, I think this is also a bad time regarding the political cycle. We are after the pandemic, and there will be natural recovery, high economic growth, but also huge stimulus connected with EU recovery funds. And I think governments in Poland and Hungary will use this money not only to make sure that recovery is happening, but also to pay for political support, to buy votes, to spend on some other social programs that will motivate voters to forget about the fiscal rules, the rule of law, and to vote for right-wing populists. And I think the EU should monitor this situation and also have more stringent rules on how this money is spent, because otherwise the populist governments of Central and Eastern Europe will pay for their political victories by money of taxpayers of all European Union member states, and we would like to avoid a situation like this.
Thank you, Marek. Now, Borja, with all of its lights and shadows, the European continent has been over the last few decades a land of individual liberties, moral freedom, and free markets, compared, of course, with other regions of the world. What is at stake right now in Europe? What is at stake with this resurgence of populism, in your view?
Yes, so lots is at stake. So basically, Europe was built upon liberties of the individual. That's how we progressed over other continents that had, either more raw materials or more people, like in Asia. Basically, the fact that you can pioneer, you can innovate, you can take home what you earn, that you are responsible for your own self and your, the other people. So that's the base of Europe. And we can just simply remember 20th century. There are some countries where national populism, fascism was growing, and other ones where social populism was growing. And mainstream parties decided to do one of these two things. Number one, appease. Appease and give them what they want so they get calm and quiet. That did not work. And the second thing was basically to accept some of the policies that the social and national populists were suggesting. So the mainstream governments were applying them, trying also to stop, the rise of the populism. That did not work either. And in the end, basically, we had wars. We had wars across Europe. Do I think that, World War III will happen soon, or European countries are going to be at war soon? No, it will not. They will not. The integration, both economically and politically, but mainly the people, is a lot higher and stronger than 100 years ago. So there are more marriages, friendships across borders. There are more knowledge of other people across the European continent. So probably we will not get to the war. However, physical war, however, there will be economical war. So the UK has started it. They just left the European Union. Other countries in Europe are going to try and demand more money. Or actually, the countries in Europe are going to say, we're not going to pay more money. So the economic war is definitely here. And when there is a division and there is a struggle, which is not in favor of the individual, but in favor of just the governments, to either promote their own policies or to increase their popular support. Basically, at the end, this division creates weakness, for Europe. So, in my opinion, the economic war will start, and eventually Europe will become decadent. We'll lose most of the economic power that we have over the wealth and the percentage of wealth that we have. We will end up being just a museum for Asians and North Americans, probably. The solution is not more integration and unity and basically everybody doing the same thing. No, that is not the solution, because usually when that happens, the people of the power, the governments, are the ones who actually increase their power. We believe in the foundation of Liberty Advancing Foundation in Spain. We believe that the way forwards to avoid economical and decadence of Europe is to give the liberties back to the individual. So, phenomenons like digital nomads, basically voting with your feet, is actually very powerful for the individual to say, hey, I don't like what's happening in Hungary, I'm moving somewhere else. And that will actually maybe not change what the Hungarian government is doing, but it will definitely become more decadent in that part, influencing fewer people, and the people who can actually will move and become prosperous elsewhere. Okay, so that will happen. Migration internally in Europe will happen. That's something that we can do. But other things is, as my colleagues were saying, is we can't be paying for everything that everybody wants, because at the end, our children, grandchildren will be paying for it. The funny thing is that we'll have fewer grandchildren. So in the end, there will be probably some collapse of the European sovereign economies, probably the euro. So what's at stake? It's not probably a physical war, but definitely poverty across Europe.
Thank you very much, Borja. We are almost running out of time, but I would like to ask, especially our two colleagues from the central and eastern part of Europe. A lot is being discussed about Hungary. And of course, we all know that Prime Minister Orbán is the one who coined this term illiberal democracy and illiberal state. You probably have a closer view than most of us have here in the western part of the continent. How do you think the situation is evolving in Hungary, and what do you expect from that country coming? I don't know, Petar or Marek would like to jump in.
I can start if you don't mind. And Poland is, and we were warning in 2013, 14, before even the current government, that the threat for Poland is urbanization of our country. So I read and follow a lot of news from Hungary, because if something happens in Hungary, there is high probability that will also happen in Poland in a year or two. And there is a lot of mutual learning between these populist governments in these two countries. What I think is important lesson from Hungary, for example, for Poland, is that cooperation matters. So in times of real emergency, and I don't speak about the pandemic, I speak about the Viktor Orban government and Viktor Orban in power for so many years, capturing all the institutions, capturing media, you need cooperation of various pro-democratic forces or forces who would like to see liberal democracy to survive. We observe this now in Hungary, where various political parties try to cooperate to have a common candidate for prime minister, to have common lists in some electoral districts so that they can beat Fidesz and Viktor Orban's candidates. And I think this is an important lesson for Poland, where also the opposition is still sometimes too much divided, and they devote too much time on criticizing each other instead of focusing on many illiberal policies that are done by the current government. As I said in the previous answer, you see some radical left-wing politicians that even endorse some economic policies of the current law and justice government. And I think what we need is similar kind of cooperation of various opposition parties, and it is needed because the situation is special. It's not a normal time, and it's not because of the pandemic, but it's also all because of the capture of various institutions like the judiciary, part of the media, other independent institutions, and this pose a threat to democratic system, to fair electoral system. And it is why I think we should learn how and monitor how this cooperation will work in Hungary among opposition parties, and hopefully it will be a useful inspiration for us in Poland.
Right, thank you very much, Marek. Petar, would you like to add something like in 1.5 minutes tops?
Yeah, just a few things. I think we have a similar kind of situation in Bulgaria, because if you look at the numbers on the economic side, they look good. We have low deficit. Of course, in 2020, there was a deficit, but before that, we were on a surplus. The growth is kind of good. Of course, not superb, but still. And the debt is extremely low, 20-25%, maybe with the pandemic close to 30. So the macroeconomic indicators are looking good, but the obstacles are in the rule of law and the corruption, captured institutions, something that Marek described perfectly. And this is, I think, more and more of the experts, economists are talking about this. And sometimes it looks strange why economists are not talking about the fiscal deficit or something like that, but discussing the judiciary. So, and if you look in the more general picture, in the economic history of Bulgaria, the closest that we've been to the average income in Europe is 55-60%. And now, yesterday we look at the data. There was a new data. Well, we are basically close to the 60%. So the question is how to break that barrier and to go further. And I think that because it will be a historical move for our country, we never break that barrier. Even the socialists went to 60% and then went bankrupt. So in order to break that barrier, I think that we need to change something different than just the economic rules. And this is close to the rule of law, independence of judiciary, corruption. So it's a deeper issue than the pure economic one.
Thank you very much, Petar. We have now run out of time. Unfortunately, the debate has been incredibly interesting, and I would like to thank everyone for attending this panel, and our three speakers: Borja Breña from the Foundation for the Advancement of Liberty in Spain, Marek Tatawa from the Civil Development Forum in Poland, and Petar Ganev from the Institute for Market Economics in our host country of Bulgaria. Please keep tuned to the Europe Liberty Forum 2021. There are many interesting contents ahead for liberty lovers like all of you. So just in a few minutes, at 1:15, we shall have the interactive breakout on healthcare, followed by the Europe Liberty Awards and the discussion by Anders Oslund and Tom Palmer. So stay with us. And again, thank you, everyone.